Hello there. My name is Danny, and this is Ale and Agony. And you guys, we have another 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, which I'm not going to lie, I wasn't expecting it. As those of you know who follow on the social media, you may have seen that Apple Podcasts now have the show listed twice, which was an accident. So I updated the RSS feed to Buzzsprout rather than SoundCloud. It just seemed like a better fit. And rather than swapping the feed or combining the two, it's accidentally been listed twice. So this new review is actually on the newer account for episode 2. And it is someone new. I did check. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't someone who previously gave a 5-star review, found the channel and gave it another one. But it's someone new. And they kindly said, Danny is a great storyteller, very informative and interesting to hear stories I've never heard before. I can't wait for the next episode, says McLovin Lady. Thank you so much. Just to make you aware, I am now also uploading the episodes onto YouTube, as my boyfriend's mum said that that's where she tends to listen to most episodes of podcasts. Podcast sites tend to confuse her, so if you're listening, hi Ellie! And you can find the YouTube channel under Ale and Agony. And before we get into today's case, let's start with the ale for this week's episode. I'm drinking an ale from a brewery that's actually very close to me. It's called Round Corner Brewery, and it's based in Melton Mowbray. And Melton Mowbray are also famous for their pork pies, and they're also licensed to make Stilton cheese. So that probably gives you a good idea of what kind of place Melton Mowbray is. And today I am drinking their West Coast IPA, which is called Hopping Spree. And I'll be telling you about the case of Jerry Brudos, aka the Shoe Fetish Slayer. So let's crack it open. Does anyone else give their can like a cheeky couple of like before they do it, or is that just a me thing? I feel like I learnt that maybe from my granddad. I'm sure my granddad used to do that. I think he said something about it would stop it from fizzing over. Absolute bullshit, probably, but I can't open a can without double tapping it twice now. Also, if Donna, my nail technician, is listening, I totally did not use my nails to do that. A warning for this episode, as it does contain details of rape, murder, dismemberment, and necrophilia. It has it all. So if you're uncomfy with any of these topics, please feel free to skip this week's episode. This episode is going to be based around the murderer instead of the victims. So it's going to be in a different format to what I've done so far. I find that when it's 4 separate victims, it's much harder because I couldn't find much information on the victims of their life before they met Jerry Brudos. So this time, the episode will be based around Jerry, and I will be giving as much information about the victims as I can find. So unlike a lot of other cases, there is a huge amount of information on Jerry's childhood. So let's start at the very beginning. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939 in South Dakota to his mother Eileen and father Henry. But things started off badly for little Jerry, quite literally from the moment he was born. Eileen and Henry already had a son called Larry, and apparently when they found out about this second unplanned pregnancy, Eileen had really hoped that this time round she would have a girl. But then along came Jerry, and she was devastated. Jerry grew up in many places, switched schools multiple times, and it's said that his father had an awful temper and that often lost him his jobs. So Henry was either at work or looking for a job. So he wasn't really around much. Eileen, however, was at home all the time, and she would routinely belittle and verbally abuse Jerry and made it clear to him on a daily basis that he is not the child that she wanted. And it wasn't as if Eileen hated having sons, because Larry was clearly adored by her. And we know that things are quite tight in the family home. You know, Henry is in and out of work quite a lot. They're moving around all the time. So I can imagine stress levels are pretty high. So maybe Eileen just resented having another mouth to feed. I don't think in reality that a daughter would have necessarily brought Eileen any happiness, but this is what she tells Jerry anyway. So Jerry's first ever relationship with another woman, Eileen, was filled with clear resentment and no love whatsoever. And when Jerry was 5 years old, he was out playing in the local dump, which he'd done quite often, and there he found a pair of stiletto high heels. And as you can imagine, they were pretty beaten up, but they had some rhinestones left on them. And little Jerry loved these shoes. The pretty sparkly rhinestones, he hadn't seen anything like them before. So he took them home. Eileen then caught 5-year-old Jerry wearing the shoes, and she was outraged. Eileen was a very traditional and prude woman. She did not wear high heels. As to her, they were an image of sin and they were taboo. She also didn't wear makeup or short skirts, and she told Jerry to take those shoes back to the dump immediately. Jerry, however, did not do as his mother asked, and he kept those shoes. And he really loved them, and he was fascinated by them. And as you can imagine, a 5-year-old probably isn't going to hide something very well. And Eileen inevitably found the shoes. She then took Jerry outside and set the shoes on fire and made him watch as they burnt up. And I can imagine for Jerry that this must have made him feel a ton of emotions. You'd be feeling, I don't know, like quite vulnerable that someone's found something, and then scared because his mother just seemed awful and this was just more ammunition for her to throw at him. I can imagine being embarrassed because you can guarantee that she made him feel shame for having these shoes. And then also frustrated and angry, like what was wrong with just having these shoes? This woman's now just burnt them up in front of him, completely destroyed them. So now footwear and violence seem to be connected to Jerry. And very soon you can add sexual arousal into the mix. As the years went by, Jerry would start to sneak into his neighbours' gardens and steal their underwear from their washing lines. And so many pairs of underwear went missing that the police were called to investigate. Can you imagine how many pairs of pants this guy had to steal that warranted the women in the neighbourhood to call the police? But rather than getting spooked at the fact that the police were now involved, Jerry thought that he could use this situation to his advantage. And rather than being scared of the police, he pretended to be one. Yes, that's right. This 17-year-old kid had the balls to pretend to be an undercover police officer who was investigating the thefts in the area. He knocked on a neighbour's door and spoke to another young teenage girl about what had been happening, and he explained that he was working undercover and wanted to discuss the thefts over at his house. The young girl agrees and later heads over to Jerry's house. And when she gets there, she goes inside, but finds that the house is empty and Jerry isn't there. And she is about to leave when a masked man jumps out at her with a knife and demands that she strips off all of her clothes. The terrified girl complies, and the masked man takes an entire camera roll of images of her while she's naked. The masked man now has what he wants, and so he leaves. And as the girl gets dressed and runs down the stairs, she bumps into Jerry. And Jerry is out of breath and panting. He asks her, "Are you okay?" Because a masked man kidnapped Jerry and locked him in the barn around the back of the house, and he has only just been able to escape. The girl runs out of the house and she knows full well that Jerry was the masked man. But Jerry also knows where she lives, and so she doesn't tell anyone about what happened. You will notice throughout this episode that Jerry is the king of escalation. Every crime he commits gets a little bolder. And right now, we've gone from the theft of underwear. You know, no one knows at this point who he is. He's made sure to never be seen. You know, he sneaks around in people's back gardens. But he then ambushes a young woman in his own home and threatens her with a knife. And he thinks his plan is super smooth and she won't know that it was him because he's masked and disguised. Jerry does admit later on down the line that he would use the underwear that he had stolen along with the photos of this young girl to masturbate to. But he could never come to a climax, and he'd never had an orgasm before. So every time he's trying to push the boundaries, hoping that he'll finally get the sexual satisfaction that he wants so badly. He must be surrounded by his peers. He's a 17-year-old guy, and although I don't think he had many friends, he must have heard, you know, sort of like locker room chats of the boys, you know, all giving it the big one about all these different girls that they're, you know, doing certain dealings with. And Jerry has had none of it. So we're amping it up again, and the next time, Jerry offers a girl a lift home from school. And on the way back, he pulls down a secluded road and demanded that the girl strip for him like he had before. But this time he's much bolder. Wears his mask. This girl knows Jerry. And he seems to be either super desperate or he just doesn't care. But the girl point blank refuses. She is not taking her clothes off for Jerome Henry Brudos. So Jerry punches the girl square in the face and then attacks her. And luckily, another car just happens to come down the secluded road and sees the commotion and gets the girl to a hospital. Jerry said to the other people in the car that the girl had just fallen out of the car and landed on her face, which is why she was bleeding, and he was just trying to help her. The girl goes to the police, and they then arrest Jerry for this attack. And when they search his home, they find an abundance of women's underwear, along with photos of a terrified naked girl. The police talk to the girl in the images, and she tells them everything. So here he is. He's caught. It's over, right? But no. Jerry doesn't get a prison sentence. He is instead sent for psychiatric help. And for the next 9 months, throughout this time, he is still allowed to go to school during the day, as long as he goes to the psychiatric hospital in the evenings. During his time there, he told doctors of his fantasies of keeping women as prisoners in a hole in the ground. And this hole in the ground, he'd planned to dig. He wanted to make it. He had these ideas. And the idea was that he would take the women out as and when he wanted them, so he could use them for his sexual pleasures. He was then diagnosed as a borderline schizophrenic and released. So he tells these health professionals who are at this institution designed specifically for people like Jerry about his deepest, darkest desires. And they're like, whoa, you are not okay. But back out into the public you go. Good luck. After the release, Jerry graduated, and then he spent a short time in the army before being discharged for bizarre obsessions. He would tell his fellow officers that a woman kept breaking into his tent at night, demanding to have sex with him, and he had to fight her off, and he refused her advances. He was then taken to another doctor whilst in the army, another therapist, and he told that therapist again of his desires of having women that were prisoners to him, and this is where he was then discharged for his bizarre obsessions. And my assumption is that that would go on some kind of record somewhere, but I don't think it does. You would think that if the army are saying, you're a bit too crazy to be here with us, I don't know, surely that would go on some record, some police record. I'd assume the army and the police are linked somehow. Maybe not. So Jerry's left the army and he's now 23 years old. So we're 6 years past the original incident where he punched that girl in the face because she refused to strip for him. And he's now back at his mum's house. So fun times for Jerry. And he's working as an electrical technician. And one of his colleagues is like, hey, I have a friend and they may be interested in going on a date. Do you fancy that? And Jerry's like, fuck yeah. And the friend is actually a 17-year-old girl called Darcy Meltzer. So there's quite a significant age gap. It's 6 years. And when I was 17, I dated a 22-year-old. So that's only a 5-year age gap. So I'm not going to make any judgments here. I'm just going to say, oh, in hindsight, maybe that's not the best thing for you. But Darcy was a pretty young woman, and so Jerry was shocked that she liked him so much. Jerry was a big guy. He was over 6 foot. He was quite portly. He had red hair. He had freckles. You know, he was known to have like a very sort of like round, sort of like piggy face. So the fact that Darcy was really into him, he was super surprised. But Darcy's parents were very much against the relationship, which may have made it more exciting for Darcy. She may have mistaken the age gap for maturity and security. Been there, made that assumption. Just throwing that in there. They later went on to have a child and got married. And Jerry would ask Darcy to clean the house in nothing but a pair of high heels. And she complied for a long time. You know, the relationship was fresh and kinky. They were naked all the time. They both seemed to be enjoying themselves. And it's also alleged that Darcy was unknowingly wearing the underwear that Jerry had continued to steal from other women. So Darcy's there thinking, oh my goodness, my husband is amazing. He's buying me lingerie. I'm having a lovely little treat. This is fantastic. And in reality, he is in fact stealing it from other women. And it is also alleged that Jerry had taken photos of Darcy with a bag over her head and had strangled her on a few occasions during sex. Darcy was complicit to the images and the kinks in the bedroom, but after a while she started to refuse Jerry of these kinks. And then baby number 2 came along, and Darcy just did not have the time or patience to be cleaning the home in high heels anymore. And she started rejecting Jerry's requests. So Jerry started amping things up for himself. And he would start to wear women's underwear under his work uniform and started noticing women outside of the house more and more. One woman in particular really caught his eye. She was wearing a pair of beautiful heels, and he was obsessed with her from the moment he saw her. So much so that he got on the same bus as her and followed her home, where he waited outside for her to fall asleep. Jerry then snuck into her home with every intention of stealing her underwear and her shoes. But the woman woke up. And Jerry, who, let's not forget, is a big guy, he got the woman onto the bed and strangled her into unconsciousness. Her unresponsive body really turned Jerry on. He hadn't been around an unconscious woman before, and he raped her while she lay there unconscious. And this is when Jerry had his first orgasm outside of sex with Darcy, and it became super clear to him that this is what he wanted. He wanted a body that was completely unresponsive. He wanted a dead woman, and he realised that he was a necrophile. His biggest fantasy was having a large walk-in freezer where he could store dead women and hang them up on hooks, and he could then take them down and dress them up and have sex with them whenever he wanted. Jerry continued to pursue his wife Darcy. He would leave photos of himself in women's underwear around the home, but Darcy would continue to ignore them and gave all of her time and attention to their 2 growing children. And I'm assuming at this point that Darcy was aware of his fetish for women's underwear, because that's quite a curveball to throw out there at random. If my boyfriend left some photos around the house of him in women's underwear, and we hadn't discussed that previously, I would be incredibly confused. Definitely, it would be the topic over dinner that night, I can tell you. It is now 1968, and Jerry meets the first of 4 women that he murders. And I will say at this point that it's the first of 4 women that we know of. We don't actually know whether there were only 4. But the first is Linda Slauson. And she was a 19-year-old Caucasian woman, and she had bright blonde hair and a big full fringe and a lovely smile. Linda met Jerry whilst doing her job of a door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman whilst she was in Oregon, where Jerry and his family now lived. Jerry offered to buy a set of the encyclopedias and invited Linda inside. He asked her to come down to the basement as the kids were upstairs and he didn't want to disturb them. And whilst in the basement, Linda is getting some books out for Jerry to look at when he grabs a 2x4 plank of wood and smashes Linda on the back of the head. And Jerry's a big fucking guy. That would undoubtedly knock Linda out. Jerry now knows what he wants. He doesn't want an unconscious woman. He wants a dead one. So he then strangles Linda to death. And in my opinion, Jerry doesn't seem to be in it for the kill itself. That part isn't really what excites him. He does it, but he's in it for the end product. He wants the body. And now he has Linda's dead body in his basement. He pops upstairs, gives Darcy some money, and tells her to take the kids out for some dinner. He then returns back to the basement, where he strips Linda's body and plays dress up with all of the stolen clothes and shoes that Darcy wouldn't wear for him anymore. And he put Linda in multiple poses like a doll. This was not planned. Linda just happened to be going around the neighborhood. Jerry took the opportunity. So he didn't have any way to keep a memento like he had before. He didn't have his camera ready. He just was not prepared. But he wanted to keep something from Linda. And so he cut off her left foot and he kept it in his freezer. And he would take it out from time to time and model all of the shoes that he had stolen. And he would then masturbate to the dismembered foot. Later that night, Jerry knew it was time to get rid of Linda's body, as he didn't really have anywhere to keep it. He didn't have, this large, luxurious walk-in freezer like he'd always dreamed of. There was nowhere to keep this body. So he drove down to the Willamette River, and he jacked up his car so it looked like he was changing a tyre, and he tied Linda's body to an engine head and threw it over the side and into the river. And Linda's body was never found. We only know about her murder because Jerry admitted to it. Jerry kept thinking about what had happened and how it was so out of the blue, it was unplanned, and he didn't really have the right setup for what he wanted. So Jerry moved his family into a new home with a separate garage. He told Darcy that he would use this garage as a dark room for developing his photos. And so he set up an intercom and told Darcy that she couldn't just wander into the garage, as it could destroy his photos that he is currently developing. So she must contact him first on the intercom. But in reality, as you may have guessed, Jerry actually set this room up into an area where he could store women and kill them. It's now 10 months later, after the death of Linda Slauson. Jerry's in his brand new home. He's got this garage. He wants to test it out. And so he finds victim number 2, Jan Susan Whitney. So on November 26th, 23-year-old Jan's car had broken down, and a couple of guys had headed over to give her a hand. Jerry was driving home from work, and he saw the 3 people crowded around the car on the side of the road and thought he would intervene. So Jerry drove up, had a quick look and said, oh, I can totally fix this problem. No problem. He just needed his tools. So Jerry takes all 3 people, including the guys, in his car, but he drops the guys off on the way there and says that he can fix the car on his own. It's a quick fix. When Jan and Jerry get back to his house, he realizes that he doesn't have his house keys and says he needs to wait for his wife to come home to let them in. So they pass the time, they have a bit of a chit chat, and Jerry asks Jan if she wants to play a game. I mean, my alarm bells are ringing, but, I'm sure Jan is probably thinking, do you know what? This guy took me, a couple of other people, seems nice enough, everything's okay. And the game that Jerry wants to play is that Jan needs to try and describe to Jerry how to tie a shoelace without using her hands. So Jan agrees, and Jerry says, I'll hop onto the back seat, and then that way I can't see your hands whilst you're describing to me how to tie a shoelace. So Jan closes her eyes and starts to describe to Jerry how one would tie a shoelace. But Jerry grabs a leather strip, and whilst he is sat behind Jan, he strangles her. He then gets out of the car and secures the leather strip into the car door so that Jan is still being choked. And as she is dying, he climbs back into the driver's seat and he rapes her in the front seat of the car. He then carried her body into his garage and dressed her up and took lots of photos. And he had sex with her dead body and then hung her up on a hook that he had installed in the garage. And he kept Jan hung there for 5 days and continued having sex with her body. But Jerry knew that he would soon need to get rid of the body. He's got nowhere to put it. So what does he do? He takes another trophy. He wants to remember his time with Jan. So does he take her right foot so that he has a pair of feet? Oh no. Jerry decides that the perfect trophy from Jan is her breast. Yep. He takes that breast and he stuffed it with sawdust as a crude attempt at taxidermy. And he then stapled it to a wooden board. So think of when you see a deer head mounted to a wooden board, or a fish mounted to a wooden board. That is the aesthetic that Jerry was aiming for. His wife Darcy apparently found this trophy, and Jerry shrugged it off, saying it was being used as a novelty paperweight. Like, it's a severed breast. What? Darcy just bought the story and then left it and never mentioned it again. During the 5 days that Jan's body was hanging in his garage, Jerry took the family away for a weekend to celebrate Thanksgiving, and someone accidentally crashed into his garage. The police were called to the scene and they started to investigate. And one of the officers shone their light into the garage through a crack in the door. But they did not see Jan's body hanging there. Like, surely after 5 days of decomposing, it would smell pretty fucking ripe in that garage. Did the police not notice that? The police instead left a card for Jerry to call them when he gets back into town. And imagine being Jerry and getting a card from the police to say, oh, someone's crashed into your sex dungeon garage and we need to come investigate. Like, I would literally shit myself. But Jerry does call them. But first, he needs to get rid of Jan's body. But he doesn't go to the river. He instead puts her body just a few yards away in the shed in his backyard. Why would he not get rid of the body off of the premises? He has told the police, yeah, of course, come on over. I can't tell if he's like living off the adrenaline of it all or if he's just super dumb. I just don't get it. And then after they leave, he then takes Jan's body to the river and he tied her to a piece of railway iron with some nylon rope and got rid of her body just as he did with Linda Slauson. And at this point, he took Linda's foot which was starting to decompose and rot, and threw that into the river as well. It's now only 4 months later, so we've gone from a break of 10 months between the first and second kill, and now it's only 4 months later, on March 27th, when Karen Sprinkler was back home for spring break. She was approached by Jerry in a parking garage and was told to get into his car. Jerry held Karen at gunpoint, but Karen wasn't aware that it was in fact a toy gun. Jerry then took Karen back to his house and made her strip and dress up in lots of different outfits for him. So at this point, she's alive. He gets her to dress up, takes the photos while she's still alive. He's now installed a pulley on the ceiling, and it's also known as a come-along wench. So once he's finished taking the photos, he puts a noose around Karen's neck and cranked the pulley slowly off the ground until Karen's body was lifted until her toes were just off of the ground. And Jerry decided now is the perfect time to have some lunch. So he left her there to hang and die over the course of the next hour. Jerry kept Karen hung in his garage for a week, and he continued to have sex with her body. And he again cut off her breasts, and this time he made a mould from them, and he made a bronze bust that is displayed on his mantelpiece in his living room. The balls and the audacity is just unreal at this point. Like, does he want to get caught? Because a lot of killers get to the point where the time between each murder is getting shorter, they become sloppier, and it's some of them say that, they want to be stopped, they want to be caught. And I can't help but think that that's what's going on here. He's already got a boob stapled to the wall. He had another body just in his shed whilst the police were in his house. And now here we are with a bronze bust just in his living room. And as before, he strapped Karen's body to another engine head with nylon rope, and he threw her off of the Bundy Bridge. And now it's only 3 weeks later, on April 21st, that Jerry tried to abduct 24-year-old Sharon Wood. But she managed to fight him off and lived to tell the tale.
I went down the stairs, and as I got down there, this guy was pointing a gun at me, and he says, "If you don't scream, I won't shoot you." He got his arm around my head, and he got somehow my jaw clamped down on his thumb in the struggle. Last thing I remember was he just really hit my head very hard, and I saw stars, and then he jumped up and ran.
So Jerry ran off with his tail between his legs, and Sharon described her attacker to the police as big, red-haired, and freckled. And the very next day, he tried to abduct a 15-year-old, but she too got away and gave the same description of big, red-haired, and freckled to the police. Jerry then tried to kidnap an even younger girl who was only 12 years old, but a neighbour spotted Jerry trying to get the girl into his car, and once again, he fled. So the 2 girls that he tried before, they were super young compared to the others, and I don't know if he was going for younger and younger girls in the hope that they would be easier to kidnap, or whether or not he was a paedophile as well as a necrophile, as well as a murderer, as well as everything else that he is. And it's easy to see at this point that brute force and threatening women wasn't working too well for Jerry. Pretending is what he's good at. Whether it's pretending to be an undercover policeman, or pretending to buy encyclopedias, or pretending to fix someone's car, it seems that kidnapping Karen in a parking garage was a fluke, and he managed to pull it off. So Jerry is now revisiting how he commits the previous crimes and how he lures women back to his garage. So he bought himself a fake police badge and a uniform. And on April 23rd, just 2 days after his attempt on Sharon Woods, he approaches 22-year-old Linda Saley. Jerry is in his full policeman getup, and he spots Linda in yet another parking garage. But this time, he's travelled a bit further afield to Portland. Linda is heading back to her car, and she has a ton of bags with her. And Linda has been shopping all day for her boyfriend's birthday. Jerry approaches her as a policeman and tells her that there has been a lot of thefts reported that day, and he thinks that Linda's hefty haul looks very suspicious, and she matches the description of the suspect, and he asks her to come down to the station. So Linda puts her bags away, and then she gets into Jerry's car. And I can't say that I blame her. I feel like you probably would, I assume, although he's not got a police car, so I'm not sure. But as you can imagine, they're not going to the station. They instead go back to Jerry's garage, and he gets her inside. There, he ties Linda up, and then he went to have some dinner. Like, isn't this the second time that he's popped off to grab some food? But when he got back, he found that Linda had broken free, but she was just sat there. She didn't use the phone that was in the garage, and she didn't run away. She was frozen in fear and sat there, paralysed. Jerry then strangled Linda and hung her body up in the garage yet again. But it's escalating an additional step this time, because Jerry pierced Linda's skin with electrodes and tried to pass electricity through her dead body in the hopes of making her dance. But Jerry didn't get the reaction that he envisioned. He wanted to make her, quote, jump like a frog in a skillet. And he was disappointed. And he took Linda's body down and threw it off the Bundy Bridge yet again. Jerry then admitted that he did not take a trophy from Linda's body. He'd contemplated taking another breast, but he said that hers were too pink. And what he means by that is that the areola on her breast was very similar in shade to her breast. So the nipple wasn't as distinct as he wanted. So he didn't cut off her breasts. At this point in time, the family of Linda Saley and Jan Whitney are tirelessly trying to find their daughters, and the police are investigating every lead that comes up. And only a few days later, on May 10th, Linda Saley's body was found by a father and son out on a fishing trip. Although Jerry had tied her body to an engine, he'd done a shoddy job, and the body had come loose and floated up to the surface. And whilst the area was being investigated, divers also found the body of Karen Sprinkler in the water only 50 feet away. Both women had clearly been strangled, and the knots used to tie them to the engines were called underwriter's knots, which are specifically used by electrical technicians. So the bodies were immediately connected, and the police had a big clue to who their suspect could be. Meanwhile, Jerry was spending time around the local university trying to get girls to go out on dates with him, and he was pretending this time to be a Vietnam vet. I don't know why he's not at home with his children. What's going on with Darcy? Who knows? But this guy is out the house all the time. So he's approaching all these young women, and on the third try, a girl accepted his date, and then Jerry was super creepy throughout the date. And he talked hypothetically about if he was the killer responsible for Linda and Karen, because their cases were now blowing up. Everyone knew about it. And he compared the sadness of the girls' deaths to his favourite football team losing 4 Super Bowls in a row. The girl was obviously super freaked out, and she called the police as soon as she got home, and alarm bells were ringing for the police after this big, red-haired and freckled guy was being super creepy and inappropriate. Jerry later called the girl up again and said that he was in town and he could meet up in 15 minutes. but she told him that she'd be ready in about an hour, and they arranged to meet. She then called the police. So when Jerry went to the arranged location an hour later, the police were waiting for him. They started questioning Jerry about why he was in the neighborhood, and he disclosed that he was an electrical technician and he was just helping out a buddy. He then gave them his real address and his real name, and then he went on his way. The police saw that Jerry lived in the same area as Linda Saley when she went missing, but all evidence so far was circumstantial. Then Jerry allowed the police to search his garage, where they found nylon rope, the same rope as the bodies were tied to the engines with. And Jerry freely told them to take some with them. He even cut a bit off and gave it to them. And this was off of the same reel of nylon rope that he'd used to tie his victims to the engines before chucking them off a bridge. So the rope was sent off to the lab, and it matched the same as the rope that they had found in the crime scene. The police also noticed, when they were in his garage, that there was lots of underwriters' knots used. So Jerry must have thought that he was so much smarter than the police. Like, yeah, no worries, here's my name, here's my address, here's my garage, here, have some rope, no worries. And then the 12-year-old girl that Jerry tried to abduct came forward and identified him to the police. And so, Jerry was arrested on May 30th. Jerry confessed to everything. He left out no details. Again, it's like a weight has been lifted from him and he can now just freely tell everybody what he's been doing. But he then called Darcy and told her to burn all of the photos that he had accumulated, along with a bag of clothes that he had stored up in the attic. And Darcy burnt some of the photos, but not all of them. And the ones left over clearly showed Jerry's reflection in the mirror as he took the photos, and the women in the photos were clearly dead. Jerry was then found guilty of first-degree murder of 3 women, and they were Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinkler, and Linda Saley. And although Jerry confessed to the murder of the encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Slauson, they had no evidence of the murder, as there was no body, no photos of her body, and the foot that he had taken as a trophy was long gone. And I feel awful for her family, because this guy is like, yep, totally did it. And they're like, well, you say you did it, but we don't have a body, so we're just not going to charge you for it. And what about Darcy? Because she was complicit as far as I'm concerned. Like, she found his boob stuffed with sawdust, and he had another bust on the mantelpiece. And she knew how dangerous he was. You know, he'd choke her during sex and photograph her with a bag over her head as she played dead. Then he calls her from prison to burn the photos. And she does. She burns some of them. Well, Darcy was put on trial for being complicit to the murders and being an accessory. But the jury found Darcy not guilty. And so her and her 2 children were given new identities and they moved away. And for all we know, Darcy's still out there, living large. Whilst Jerry Brudos was in prison, he was allowed to keep multiple shoe magazines. And he even wrote to major companies and asked for them to send him some catalogues as a substitute to pornography. And it is said that Jerry was sodomized by other inmates 6 months into his sentence, and he went on to become one of the guards' favourite prisoners. So if you were worried that Jerry got an easy time in prison, this was certainly not the case. And after 37 years in prison, Jerry died of liver cancer on March 28th, 2006. And that is the story of Jerry Brudos, the Shoe Fetish Slayer. What a piece of shit that man was. My God. When I was researching this case, I audibly gasped at the boob being stuffed with sawdust and being stapled to a piece of wood. I am actively grabbing my boobs right now. That sounds horrific. I will also list in the show notes the YouTube documentary that I watched, and this is where I got the sound bite of Sharon Woods, who was the survivor. And I also listened to the 2 episodes of the last podcast on the left, as they also covered this case. So you should definitely go check them out if you want to hear their take on this case. But let's get back to the very beginning. How was my ale? Well, it's a tasty boy. Oh my goodness. Very much like Jaipur, it has that same concentrated hoppiness going on. It's a beautiful golden colour, and it has actually won a couple of golden awards. And you can tell from the first sip that it's a stronger ale, and it packs a wallop at 6.6%. And I personally haven't seen this brewery in the shops yet, so you can find a can of Hopping Spree West Coast IPA on the brewery's website, which is roundcornerbrewing.com. And I personally bought a couple of everything, and they have a really big variety of stouts, if that's also your jam. You can find updates about new episodes over on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll be sure to post the photos of this case over on our Instagram page. And both pages can be found over at Ale and Agony. And if you have some spare cash and you'd like to support the show and throw it at me, then you can totally do that. And you can find me on Patreon, also under Ale and Agony. And I'll be sure to give you a shout out next episode. I would, of course, be super grateful for any feedback and maybe some more cheeky 5-star reviews over on Apple Podcasts, which I will read out for you at the beginning of the next episode. Thanks again, McLovin lady, you beautiful bean. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and well done on getting through to the end. I hope to catch you on the next episode. Goodbye, my friends.